lot of people move through life with goals. Far fewer move through life with a plan that actually reflects who they want to become. We're taught to work hard to chase success, to achieve more, to accumulate, to keep moving. But eventually a deeper question shows up. What is actually all of this for? Today's conversation is about that question. My guest is David Howe, a leader whose life spanned military service, executive leadership, coaching, and now mission-driven work, helping others rebuild hope after profound loss. In this episode, we talk about life planning, not as a rigid formula, but as a way of living with intention. We explore what it means to define success holistically, how to think beyond career and income alone, why so many people drift through life without ever truly designing it, and how clarity, purpose, and service can shape a life with fewer regrets and more meaning. This conversation is for anyone who has been achieving, but still wondering if they're aiming at the right thing. Here's my conversation with Dave Howe. Dave Howe, welcome to the show.
Well, it's great to be here, Ryan. Thanks for the opportunity.
Who is Dave Howe and what is his mission?
Dave Howe is somebody that has really had almost two careers. I did over 30 years in the United States Army, retired as a colonel. And then I've also, I'm coming up on almost 30 years in my civilian career, where most of that has been in professional services, places like Deloitte Consulting. So I've really been blessed to have really that two career track. And now I am working and leveraging the skill set from both of those career paths as a member of the Comfort, Peace, and Freedom Foundation, which has been created by a guy by the name of Ken Rusk to aid the families of our fallen heroes. So we offer the life planning program that I'll certainly be talking about at some point today to those families as a way for them to try and reestablish hope and get themselves back on a path that's going to allow them to optimize their life after they've had what probably is the worst day that they're ever going to experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then on the for-profit side, Ken also provides his planning program and other solutions. And then he uses the proceeds from the for-profit side of what we do to also help partially fund the foundation efforts. I'm dual-hatted in that I'm working both sides of the street there. That's who I have been in the past and where I am right now. As has always been the case, I've always found myself in a place that I really enjoy going to work every day. It to me isn't really work. It's a calling, and it's a very enjoyable ride, and hopefully it'll continue for quite some time.
Well, I like that you said calling there at the end. That was one of the things that I heard in what you said, is that you've really lived a life of service. You had really two full professional lives, one in uniform, including the 82nd Airborne and the 12th Special Forces Group, and one in boardrooms. When you strip away all the rank and titles and accomplishments, who did those years shape you to be?
Well, possibly an interesting way of looking at it is those experiences shaped me, developed a skill set that allowed me to be a great youth coach. So I coached my daughter and my son in softball, baseball, football, and had an amazing experience with that. They've now gone on to college. So those days are somewhat in my past, but I think focusing on that college and then, that what I did professionally really set me up for success in that critical facet of life. And that's also one of the reasons why I highlighted the coaching is I do want to really highlight the fact that life planning really needs to be a holistic approach to life, not just what do I got to do to be, successful in my career. Because if you lose out all the other facets in life, you may very well be setting yourself up for failure or at least a lot of recriminations and regrets down the road. So I'm blessed that I'm not going to have a whole lot of regrets whenever my last day comes. And I'm now passionate about trying to help other people make sure they have the same peace as they go forward.
Again, I sort of summarized it as saying a life of service. But I wondered, Dave, what was it that called you to this life? Was it upbringing or family or friends or desire to have an impact? What was it for you early on that sparked you down this path?
It's a great question. Lots of answers, many of which I probably still to this day don't know.
Yeah.
I ended up going into the military. I originally went to college to be a doctor. Well, after calculus, I realized unless my dad bought a medical school, I was not going to be a MD.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, plan B was my grandfather was actually one of the first non-physician hospital administrators. So I thought that sounded pretty cool. And this way the
Yeah.
doctors would work for me rather than the other way around. So that put me on the business track. And as a freshman in college, I had absolutely zero interest in going into the military. But I started doing ROTC because they had a rifle team, and I loved to shoot rifles. So I got involved in the program, and I found out I was basically very, very good at this.
Yeah.
And so as it got to be career time where, okay, you can't stay in college forever, you got to go do something.
Yeah.
I said, well, let me give this Army thing a try. I'm like, I probably won't do it for a career, but it will certainly be good for my resume. I'll learn a lot of skills. It'll be really helpful. I don't have to worry about interviewing coming out of college and all that aggravation. So the next thing I know is I'm on active duty as a regular Army officer. I loved it, and I was very good at it, and it really did meet that need of service. I'm sure I got a good part of that from my family and my faith. Those are probably the two biggest pillars that made this the road that I ended up.
Yeah. So interesting. I talk to so many people. I have a business. I coach people, and your early interpretation of failure, like you talked about calculus, right? And how it wasn't for you, right? So your ability to sort of switch and then, hey, I like shooting rifles, and you find a situation where you're excelling at. What was the turning point where you're like, oh, wow, this is something that, there's sort of a sense of momentum. I now know I'm going in this direction.
Yeah, I think the pivotal point that put me on a military career path was in between junior and senior year in college. You go for what is the equivalent of officer basic training. So I was out at beautiful Fort Riley, Kansas for 6-8 weeks. And at the end of that, that's where I really knew I was good at this, because you get ranked against your peers. You're constantly being evaluated on your skills. And I was always at the very top of that list. I wasn't the honor grad or anything that great, but I was pretty good at this, and people knew that I was pretty good at it. And then the real final thing that I needed that probably put me on the path that I ultimately ended up on was I really thought I was going to come back, because all the cadets get jobs when they come back in the battalion. And I just figured I'd be the captain of the rifle team. I mean, what else would they do with me? Well, It turned out they made me the operations officer, which was essentially the third ranking guy in the battalion. And when that happened, I was like, okay, well, they see that more so than even I do, perhaps. And then that experience of running all of the training exercises and the drills and so forth, I began to see that I do have a natural ability that this kind of stuff that I'm doing with ROTC is honing. And then it was a very easy decision to say, well, let me give this a try on active duty and see where that leads me. And if nothing else, I think I'm going to get some really great experience out of leading people, managing things, accomplishing things at a much higher level of responsibility that I would likely get just coming out of college and any other, starter job that you would get coming out of business school.
I think it's interesting to hear you talk about that. You thought they would have you in one position and they had you in the third ranking position in the battalion. It's sort of, it sounds like that was a point for you where you're like, wow, they see something in me that I'm sort of just discovering is important. And it's interesting. I wonder if that's tied to your work now, because you're helping people sort of see their value in a different light. Is it?
Yeah, actually, as you've already highlighted, it has been a life of service and so on. And when you realize that you have something that's a talent, the military teaches you a lot of great things, one of which is you reinforce success and you shut down failure. Or at least temporarily. That's not to say you give up, but
sure.
You have to realize between where you're getting return on investment and where you probably are not ready for that. And if it's needed to be done, then you need to come up with a different game plan. But the military experience that I had really set me up for what then became my civilian career, where I was able to leverage a lot of the skills that I had picked up throughout my military career.
Yeah, and you talked a little bit about success there. And I think most people measure success sort of by accumulation, right? But looking back, and I think we can kind of laugh at that, because I do think that is something in society that is just people often discover the hard way that's not what it's about, right? I know I certainly had an experience like that. But when you look back over 60 years of leadership, what did success cost you before you learned how to properly define it for yourself?
Well, as a young single person, it's very easy to get very tunnel vision on your career, and everything else sort of goes by the wayside, and oh, there'll be time for that later and so on. And I was pretty much in that mindset up until my early 30s, and I had just started working at Deloitte, and we were in a business meeting, and one of my partners were doing whatever they were doing, so I was only semi-engaged.
Yeah.
And that's when I had my epiphany that if I advised my clients the way I'm running my personal life, they would fire me in a heartbeat. And so
Yeah.
at that moment, I had my come to Jesus moment with myself. And I said, I need to be doing the same kind of strategic planning to make sure that I'm optimizing my journey through life, like I'm trying to advise clients in how to optimize their path through the business world. And so
Yeah.
as a result of that, going back almost 30 years ago is when I had my epiphany. I came to this realization. And then fast forward, I ran across Ken Rusk, who also had the same epiphany. And he took it one step farther, which is he actually wrote it step by step how to create these life plans in his book, Blue Collar Cash. And I ran across him and I saw that this would be something that'd be very helpful for the military. And I wrote him literally an old-fashioned letter,
Yeah.
and he responded and said, "Sure, I need somebody on my team at your level." And then the rest is history. I've been working with him for going on over 2.5 years now, and it's been a great
Yeah.
fit. And it's really a wonderful capstone to my professional services and my military career. Be doing this because I'm doing this for everybody, not just for the military, but the military does have a special place. And that's why the suit is I'm now talking to people in Congress,
Yeah.
the Department of War, as it's called these days,
Yeah.
to get this program adopted for people in uniform, for our veteran communities, to be able to address a number of issues that are confronting both those communities.
Well, I want to get more into your work here in just a moment, but I just wonder as we're sort of getting an idea of your career or whatnot, how did you define success? You sort of hinted at this, but how did you define success early on? And as you moved through your career, how did it evolve and what does it look like now?
Yeah. Again, as you're a young person, as I already touched on, you start getting focused on your career is how you measure yourself. And that's pretty much
Mhm.
it. And then you can say, okay, how much have I accrued in the bank? What kind of vacations I'm taking? Sort of those
Yeah.
superficial things that you sort of
Sure.
alluded to earlier.
Yeah.
But fortunately, once I had that epiphany moment and I created my plan, it was a holistic plan. It wasn't just how to get to the next level in my professional life. It
Hmm.
was relationships, personal health. What do you do when you're not doing what you do for a living? And that you
Yeah.
need to have something there that's meaningful. And one of the things that really helped me to redefine what success was to backward plan my life is to go to your last day, you're on your deathbed, what are the things that you would be recriminating over that you did
Yeah.
not do? And that's where you start the life planning process is those things that you absolutely have got to get done. And that's how you start to measure success is to make
Yeah.
sure the things that you truly, truly want to have out of your life's journey, you get those things prioritized and you get those things done. And then anything else you get done, okay, well, then that's pure gravy, but at least you're not going to
Yeah.
be kicking yourself that, I should have done this or I wanted to do that or I shouldn't have done that because that prevented me from doing this or whatever. And it really does start to focus you more on the relationships that you need to be building to have that holistic life rather than, you know, your whole world revolves around who you work with and what you're doing on the job.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that probably most people, they never think about that. It's like, if starting from your last day and building backwards, like it seems it's one of those things simple, but perhaps not easy, but it's also profound in a way, right? It's like the intentionality behind that, it's going to just create an energy that's going to give you a completely different life. So
No,
you are,
I heard on one of your podcasts, you were talking about how you had your checklist earlier in life and
yeah,
you were doing a great job checking them off and you were suddenly getting to the end of the checks. And if I remember, you're not misquoting you too much, you're like, "Yeah, I'm not feeling it the way I thought I would be
yeah,
feeling at this point." And so, your experience would probably be really valuable to hear how you sort of figured out the same thing that I was trying to describe, which is you really need to be looking at your life in its totality and
yeah.
every facet of life, not just being very myopic in, your career, how many toys you got, how much
Mhm.
money is in the bank.
Yeah. Well, I think that that was, if I would have thought of it that way, like, let's do it, let's start at the end and work our way to the beginning. In a lot of ways, I don't think I've ever framed it that way, but that's sort of what I sort of had to do. It's like, who are you going to be? Right. And then you sort of retroactively become that person. And you sort of, even the days where you fall short of your expectations, you take notes and you go to tomorrow, right? That type of thing. But it really is, part of this podcast is talking to people like yourself to try to find out, what it is. I'm sort of working that out a bit, and I want it to be something really intentional. Yeah, it's no mistake that we're speaking right now, but I love that this idea of life planning is sort of a focus of your work. And so it's interesting though, when you say life planning, the first thing I think of is financial planning. And I'm sure that's part of that certainly comes into it, right? But what is the scope of the meaning of life planning when you talk about it?
Yeah, basically a couple points on the why of life planning. Already talked about my epiphany that, hey, you need to have a plan. And corporate America has been doing this forever. Every company, no matter what size, has some kind of strategic operational plan, whatever. So everybody gets that. Even if you're not in business, everybody understands that. But you flip it around, and on the individual level, there have been a number of studies over many years at different universities that show that less than 1% of us have a written plan for our lives that we obviously have posted someplace that we periodically refer to guide us on our journey. And whereas in corporate America, everybody appreciates that the return on that investment is significant and worth the effort. The individuals in the studies that had that written plan, and these are over a long period of time, so they actually do have meaning to them, they were 9 times more successful. So think of an average family making $100,000 this year. You suddenly have a life plan, you join the 1%ers, you're now making $1 million a year. Not that money is the only metric, but money does buy a lot of other things that are really helpful. And as you said, life planning is not financial planning. Yes. Is there a budgeting chapter in Ken's book? And is that a module in the program? Absolutely. Because you got to have the funds, not just the vision.
Sure.
But the funds are more, money is to get things that are important, not a be all and end all in and of itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
You don't get a better place in heaven if you have a big net worth when you hit the gates.
Yeah. You shared an outline of what this looks like, right? You talked about vision and visualization, goal setting, goal achievement, support network, and updating plans. So walk us through somebody, who's, perhaps in their 30s like you are, who's introduced to this and it's like, okay, I like this idea of intentionality. Where do they start?
Well, again, the program starts, and none of this is necessarily rocket science. A lot of people, if they literally sat down and thought about this topic, they would come up with something that would probably be workable. So it's not like this is the one and only way to achieve this.
Yeah.
But you begin with the vision. What is it, big picture, that you really want to achieve in your life? And you figure out the various facets of your life. So again, career is important, money is important, but relationships is far more important, I believe. Taking care of yourself physically and mentally, and spiritually. A lot of very, very, a lot of people have all of those other facets where they look like they're just having the best life ever. The Facebook kind of people, where, every lunch is the most awesome and, every sunset's the most brilliant. And that's great. But if you're really not taking care of every facet to include, your soul and nurturing whatever you consider that, it doesn't have to be a religion-based thing, but I think everybody needs to have something that they see inside themselves. It's more important than just, what's on their business card or how many clicks they get on their social media platforms or whatever the metrics that they're currently using happen to be. So you need to visualize that. And any professional person will tell you, if you can see yourself making that putt, you can see yourself making that touchdown catch, whatever that the case may be, you're going to be a lot more likely to do that in reality, as opposed to if, you constantly see yourself missing the putt, dropping the ball, whatever, well, then guess what? That may very well be what your future happens to look like. And that's not the future that you want. So once you have that locked in and you're constantly replaying that highlight reel as to what you really want to accomplish and that you can accomplish it, then you're ready to go into goal development. And that's very simple.
Yeah.
Start defining as specifically as you can what it is that you want to achieve. And then that leads into, okay, I have the goals that are needed to achieve my vision. How do you go about goal achievement? And there are books written on these topics. So,
Sure.
we won't try and, solve all of it at one
Yeah.
time today, but you do need to have a commitment, and the way you structure your program with, at least commit that you do this one thing before the end of every day or the end of
Yeah.
every week. You have, that is exactly the same kind of secret sauce that's in this program, which is you need to take the vision, the goals, and then break that down into actionable things on almost a daily basis that you can do to achieve ultimately that vision. Because if you don't get it down into, tomorrow at 2:00, I'm going to do X, and that's going to
Yeah.
help me with goal number 3, then you're still letting life bounce you around and hoping rather than really guaranteeing you're going to achieve a particular goal. And then obviously, once you have the standard, process of how you achieve things, the networking, which is building a network of people that will help you stay focused, help keep you accountable, not in a belligerent or,
Sure.
dogmatic, brutal coaching kind of way, but, the people care. And like in Ken's organization, he literally has an entire wall in his office space devoted to people's goals, and then the organization celebrates as people achieve things on their goals. So, a child going to college, or even a brand new car, or a dream vacation, whatever it happens to be, that's now
Yeah.
been checked off, and then everybody sort of says, well, they did it, so I can do it too. And you
Yeah.
really build a culture that leads people to stay with something like this, because life planning can be like dieting or anything else. It's,
Sure.
yeah, I'm all fired up for that. And then, 2 weeks, 2 months into it, it's like life happens, and your plan ends up collecting dust in the corner of the office rather than being, posted on the
Right.
refrigerator or mirror or wherever. You'll see it frequently throughout your day.
Hmm. Well, I
And then
think,
the last thing is
yeah.
you got to update these because life changes. So it's not like you
Yeah.
do it once and then 20 years
Yeah.
later you pull it out. Yeah, it's still working. Parts of it may very well be,
Yeah.
but it's not going to look the same. You
Yeah.
get married, you have children, you get
Hmm.
promoted, whatever the cases that are going to cause you to have to do a serious edit on your plan needs to take place. And then the last thing that I really want to highlight on the whole plan process is if you do have a family, integrate them into this, where either you have a family plan or at least everybody is at the table and you're talking about it so they understand why dad's not home for their soccer game, perhaps, or you
Yeah.
figure out a way that you achieve what you need professionally and can do both. That's the optimal thing. And if you put a lot of effort into it, you may have to get up at dark 30 to be able to then get an earlier flight back because you had a
Yeah.
8:00 meeting rather than a 2:00 meeting.
Yeah.
So those are the kinds of things that really go into the whole planning process that the program relies on. And so the program, literally at the end of it, you end up with your first draft of your life plan and the skills to go along with that.
Yeah. I think that there was one of the weird effects that I sort of had is Brian Tracy was like my go-to guy. I first heard a lot of these principles from him. And I remember I sort of got thrust into this corporate career where leadership was not what I thought it was, And so as I sort of was working through this, had this, I made a checklist. It was like, okay, make X amount of money. It was all very much, I didn't think about why. And I achieved those goals and it felt really sort of off to me. And I think I was just like, well, I didn't sort of update the plan. And that seems like it was like, okay, wait a second, this wasn't what we thought it was. I sort of took that as a defeat. And I almost have this weird thing where I don't want to achieve goals now because I don't want to end up at that thing again. When I say goals, like, it just is, what if it's not what I think it is, sort of type thing. So I think even though I've read literally hundreds of books on this, and I think a lot of people have, there's a reason why there's hundreds of books on it. It's a basic idea, but it has to be nuanced enough to be able to hit somebody to where it's going to flip a switch, And so I'm always listening to this. And that's just what showed up for me is I didn't update my plan. I just was like, well, I guess I can't really write a plan, and I think that's part of the mistake there. Obviously that's changed and I've got a really clear plan, but I think, this conversation is even calling me to tighten that up a little bit more. And as you
Join the
go
one
on,
percenters.
what's that?
Join the one percenters.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that was the thing there was a study that Brian Tracy talked about where I think he said that they had a graduating class of Harvard or something like that. And they said, okay, you have to set your goals. And there was only 3% of them that wrote down their goals. And those 3% were, I think they had a couple different metrics, but essentially 90% more successful than everybody else for writing it down. So there's some type of correlation there.
Yeah, and that's one of the studies based on that brief description. It's one of the ones I was mentioning earlier. So yeah, this isn't, trust me, it'll work.
Yeah.
And there's no guarantees, but it's sort of, if you put in the effort, chances are you're going to get a return on that investment, and it's not going to be flatlined or where you're disappointed that, boy, that was not a good use of my time because it didn't work out the way I thought it was.
Yeah. So you go on to discuss additional life skills like building a skyscraper. What is it when you say building a skyscraper? I can guess what that might be, but tell me about that.
In addition to the obvious basic building blocks of how to create a life plan and be successful in executing that we've already talked about, Ken throws in some other. They're better than bells and whistles, but they're cool ideas the way he thinks about things.
Yeah.
And the skyscraper chapter module deals with. Most of us have never been involved with or have a clue as to how to build a skyscraper.
Yeah, right.
But if you sat down and you just started to think, what would be the steps? What would the fundamental outline work plan look like to build a skyscraper? You're going to need land. You're going to need to have contractors. You're going to need to have material. You could literally start coming up with a lot of the basic fundamental steps that anybody that builds skyscrapers would say,
Sure.
Yeah, those are all things that we consider, right from the get-go. So that's the kinds of additional skills that Ken provides in the program to allow people to have even more of a skill set in goal attainment by being able to have that kind of ability to think through the ambiguous situations that life is always throwing at you. And I'm sure you can think of a million professional situations where somebody gave you a mission to accomplish, and you're like, well, I've never done that. Why did you give it to me?
Yeah.
I know I became the go-to guy. If the company didn't know what to do with something or had never been done before, they're like, yeah, give it to Howe. And I think the reason was they knew with my paratrooper background, you're literally used to jumping into not just unknown situations, but potentially hazardous situations. So you develop that kind of survival mindset where it's like, okay, well, nobody's going to kill me if I screw this up. So at least I don't have that as the worst case scenario if I don't do very well on this. And so it frees you up to be positive and to go tackle it. And a lot of times that's all you need is to have a positive attitude going into something that you have no idea what you're doing. But I've got enough of a skill set that I'll figure it out. And that's where the skyscraper thing sort of comes from is if you think about it, you can come up with a pretty credible first cut. And then you find people that you can subcontract with or partner with or contract with to give you the skill sets that you're never going to develop that deep vein of knowledge, obviously. But you at least know that it's there and it's part of the process.
I want to share something personal with you. I worked with Steve Lang and his Aura AI agency. That's AURA. That experience gave me a level of clarity I didn't realize I was missing. Steve has an ability to listen and reflect back what's actually there in a way that helps you see yourself clearly. What's changed most is my ability to speak about what I do with confidence and precision. If you're someone who knows you have something meaningful to offer, but you're not sure how to fully articulate it, I highly recommend working with Steve and Aura. It's been one of the most valuable investments I've made myself and my work. To learn more about Steve and his work, visit him on linkedin.com/Steve Lang, Aura AI Agency. That's linkedin.com/in/Steve Lang, Aura, AURA, AI Agency. The link is in the show notes. This is what I hear, especially with the world we live in now, where literally the way I experience it is every piece of space is sort of taken up, whether it's, a screen or a message or something. And what I sort of heard you say there with you don't know how to build a skyscraper, but if somebody said, okay, I want you to sit down and think about how to build a skyscraper, you could come up with something. And to me, what I heard there was you're making space to solve problems. And I think that is something I talk about. And I think one of the benefits and the reason why there's coaching is becoming so popular is because people don't have space in their lives to figure out how to build a skyscraper, and it's like, well, why would I consider that anyway? And it's like, well, for the natural problem solving and developing that, well, how do you think you'd build it? Those are some skills that I think, at least from my upbringing in the 80s and 90s, is I didn't get as many of those. So I think that's valuable curriculum.
Well, I actually think that, and maybe I'm wrong because I'm certainly no AI expert, but
yeah,
I tend to think that kind of a skill set where you can take ambiguous things and start to put together solutions. I don't think AI is going to be able to do that anytime in the near future, whereas an awful lot of other things AI can do as well, if not better, and then obviously a lot cheaper than human beings. So,
yeah.
Like my son is in business school, and he for some reason he and his friends all wanted to be finance guys. I said, that's fine. Great career, but you got to be careful what niche you're going to go into, because an awful lot of those green eye shade kind of people, their jobs aren't going to be around for much longer if they're even still there, because the computer can do that kind of stuff every bit as well, including some of the basic analytical stuff, looking for patterns and so forth. So you need to be able to work with people and to bridge the technology to reality. And if you can do that, then you got guaranteed employment and a future career path. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself never getting out of a cubicle, and I wouldn't wish that on anybody.
Yeah, right.
One of the great things about being in the military is I never became a cube person. I always had an office someplace. I was always high enough on the food chain that I never had to, look across at my colleague, every hour, every day that I'm at work. I think that would have completely freaked me out and driven me into a different career.
Sure. Yeah, I think that there was a time in my early 30s where I thought, I'm going for this 9-to-5 cubicle situation. And I'm like, what was I thinking? Like, I can't do that. I'm too, energetic, and it just wouldn't suit me. But, you mentioned AI, and I don't want to go down this road. I think there will be some disruptive things that happen because of AI. But I think ultimately even in the financial sector or whatnot, and this is, of course, a projection, and I don't have a crystal ball, but I think it's really, we're going to get to a point where human connection and authenticity are going to be a big deal, right? It's going to be like, are you a real person? That's going to be almost currency, right? I mean, like you are, and you have authentic conversations with people. And I think we're starting to see that a little bit, but I think that's ultimately, hopefully that's a good outcome that might happen from this AI thing, I think here.
Yep, absolutely.
So for families of fallen heroes, as you know better than I do, grief changes everything. What role does future planning play when the future itself sort of feels shattered?
Well, and again, we're in our infancy with doing this.
Yeah.
But the theory, which has been validated by everybody from a guy I served with in the military who also had a dual career with the VA system as a clinical psychologist, he's gone through the program in detail and indicates that clearly having a holistic way of trying to optimize your life's journey is a great way to prevent dark thoughts from eventually leading to suicide. So it's not a suicide prevention program, but it can be beneficial in that space, help people that are struggling with PTSD, regardless of what the original, childhood trauma is still trauma as much as if it happened to you on the battlefield. So again, while the program wasn't designed with that in mind, it absolutely is a priority community that the program could be successfully used for.
Yeah. So if someone is listening, is thinking, I just don't have time to plan my life, what are you hearing underneath that?
Yeah. That's the classic, I don't have time to do it right, but I can do it right the second time after I screw it up the first time because I didn't take the time to do it right. And usually, I really haven't run into too many people like that these days. I mean, there are some people that actually don't know that they're like that, and you do have to sort of
Oh,
coach
yeah.
them through
Mhm.
without putting a mirror in front of them and scaring the heck
Yeah.
out of them. They're like, "Oh my God, that's a horrible creature I'm looking at in the mirror." But fortunately, that's not something. Now, the grieving process is something that this program was, and why Ken created the foundation is it absolutely can be the strategic framework, like it is for everything else. Every individual, this is sort of that strategic framework upon which all the other great things in life, all the other great programs that are in existence to help people, to include Gold Star families, for example, can be brought underneath and better optimized through a strategic look. But otherwise, if you just keep doing all the tactical successes, you can pay for somebody's house, you can get them a high-speed wheelchair, you can do all these absolutely wonderful things, but you're solving a tactical problem. You're not really addressing, okay, now I can get around better, my house is easier to navigate, but what has that now really allowed me to do that's going to make my life better?
Yeah.
And one of the other things is people get stuck in grief because of the loss of hope. They
Yeah.
just have really been dashed, and to try and find joy is oftentimes really difficult. But if you go into a almost academic environment to create this plan, eventually it's no longer as an academic thing. People can start that
Yeah.
visualization process, and they can see at least something, some reason to get through today, to get into tomorrow, to look towards next month, and that life has not truly ended. It's different. It's never going to be the same, but it allows you to fight through that as a new tool in the toolbox to help people that are struggling for whatever reason that got them onto a path that they don't want to be on, certainly not for any length of time.
You mentioned you haven't ran into too many people like this, but in your experience, what is it that's sort of quietly breaking down in people that never decide to design their life intentionally?
You do have free spirits, and you have the Bill Gateses of the world that can be
Sure.
inspirational to people who really say, "Well, I don't need to do that," or that the guy who I don't have time to do that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and some people can have absolutely, rock star lives without committing to anything that's
Yeah.
remotely as rigorous as this. But the one upside is the program, while it is very step by step, and it will take a little bit of investment of time. The online version of the program, the running time of the modules, the actual talking part,
Mhm.
is a little over an hour. So you
Yeah.
break that up into 8 chunks. I mean, it's 10 minutes a module. That's not a massive. I mean, think of how much time people spend on their phones
Oh,
looking at
sure.
cat videos
Yeah.
or whatever today's equivalent is.
Yeah.
So, I don't want to hear that you don't have the time. You may not
Right.
have the interest, but don't tell me you don't have the time.
Yeah.
So I think there's lots of ways to sort of work through that. And when people start to get into it, they usually the idea is not cryptic. It's not something that you have to be a nuclear physicist to understand the concept. Once you get
Sure.
immersed in it for any length of time, you can be like, yeah, okay, I see that this is probably a good use of my time. Because when
Mhm.
you're trying to optimize your entire life's journey and the return on that investment, like the 9 times better than from the 1 percenters to the 99 that don't have a written plan,
Yeah.
the light bulb comes on pretty quickly for most everybody. And there'll always
Sure.
be those free spirits out there, the Jeff Bezoses of the world. And we need those kinds of people. And yeah, they
Yeah.
don't need to have a written thing on their refrigerator door to remind them that, okay, yeah, I got a critical to do coming up on Thursday that,
Yeah.
is critical for one of my most important goals in life.
I never have studied Jeff Bezos too much, but I think he strikes me as the story that I do understand. It strikes me as that story. I mean, I remember there's this interview of him like driving this old, 1980 something car, and they're like, why do you have this Amazon.com? You're losing money every year. And he just was like, well, I have a plan. Trust me, it's gonna, it's gonna come to fruition. And he sort of had that mindset for years. He was committed to it. And, who hasn't heard of Amazon? I mean,
Right.
it's everything from a brand to a marketplace to a TV channel. It's everywhere, right? So I don't know, that strikes me as he did have sort of this plan that he really, really committed to, where he was very intentional about where do I want to end up. And so I don't know, but I wanted to shift a little bit and talk about your sort of corporate career. And you mentioned this a couple of times. You use the word holistic, right? You're like, okay, it's great that businesses come up with a business plan. So that way everybody knows what the importance of the work is and what the ideal you're working towards and whatnot. And so after 30 years in several Fortune 100 companies, you talked about integrating employees' life plans with the corporate planning. Why does that idea still make a lot of organizations uncomfortable?
Well, I don't need and we're just getting into this, offering it as one of our main workshops, which is another way. It's separate from the life planning, but one of the workshops is this integration that you just touched on, where the company either provides or encourages their employees to get a plan, whether it's through us or anybody else, doesn't really matter. But as long as the employees have something that's really solid, that can then be integrated into the corporate strategic plan, and you get a synergistic effect by doing that. And usually most companies that hear that, the light bulb instantly goes on. It's like, well, I never thought of that. It's not, that's a really dumb idea, or we thought of that, or we tried that, or there's none of that kind of resistance that we've found in our infancy of bringing this as one of our chief solutions. But because most people would look at it and go, well, yeah, if you make a little investment in time and maybe money in your employees to get them to have a much better picture of where they're going and how they're going to get there in life. And part of that is obviously going to be their career in that organization. And then you bring those pieces together, and then you use that as the foundation from which you start doing strategic corporate planning. And the next thing you know is you have a much more motivated, committed workforce, because it's, you do something good for me, chances are I'm going to try and do something good for you, as opposed to, you're over there doing your thing and, I'm over here doing my thing for 8 hours a day and you pay me and, transactionally, that's fine. But it's not the thing that gets you a lot of what Ken loves to talk about, and it's actually one of the modules, is intrapreneurship. Everything from Shark Tank, entrepreneurship is all over. Everybody, wants to be an entrepreneur, but it's building that kind of mindset in employees within the organization where they are looking at the company from a owner's perspective, which is one of the reasons why ESOPs, employee stock programs, is one of the things that uses a workshop, because you want to talk about how you can get your employees producing a lot more and being more bought into the corporate vision, make them part of the ownership. I mean, I remember a million years ago, United Airlines was having real problems with their union. And then they suddenly figured out, if they gave them a piece of the action, brought them to the boardroom table, next thing they know is that they are not having anywhere near the labor struggles that they were having at that time. So it does absolutely work. And for most people, to your original point, they get that idea pretty quickly. You don't have to do a whole lot of coaching for them to buy into that concept. They sort of, once it's presented to them, they say, yeah, okay, we get it. Let's go do it.
Yeah. That reminds me of, there's a CEO that I spoke to on here named Dan Bowling of the Genesis company. And he was talking about how he stays up at night. What keeps him up at night is this idea of, is the mission sort of aspirational enough for people to spend their lives working on that? And I was like, I mean, to me, that showed me new heights of leadership, right? Because he was asking these folks to do this work, and he's like, what is it that's going to make it meaningful? And then people are going to spend, because he said, I've got somebody who's been with me for like 20 some years. What is making that work meaningful? And I think there's something that happens when the leader is asking that question that people feel, in a real level, and it gives, it allows space for meaning to the work, and that's kind of, in a very, I don't know, like I said, aspirational fashion. That sort of seems to be what he was building there. So
absolutely.
What happens to performance, since this is what we're talking about, when people are sort of feel like they're building somebody else's vision and they're not, I love that word. I don't know if I've ever used it. It certainly makes sense to me, but intrapreneurship, right? What happens when that's not instilled in a company?
Well, unfortunately, most companies, if they're really honest, that's probably the model that they're in right now, which is, not necessarily, it's pure mercenary where, people are clocking in and clocking out, right on, 9 o'clock and 5 o'clock, before and after those times, there's nobody in the building except the C-suite people. But by integrating what the employees are looking for, you'd start to get that kind of buy-in where, I mean, a metric will be almost immediately there. You will start seeing people showing up earlier, staying later, more time on the weekends. And I'm not trying to take hours out of people's lives
Sure.
to make more widgets or make the C-suite, bigger bonuses.
Hmm.
Because it needs to go, the integration process needs to be everybody is going to rise with that tide, as opposed to some boats rise and everybody else is still in dry dock and they're not really benefiting from the process.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
again, this is new, but I haven't seen any organization where you're not seeing everybody benefit from this approach. And a lot of it is not even so much necessarily going to show up on a financial statement. It's going to show up in softer things like your retention is going to be better, which is going to reduce your recruiting costs. These kinds of things are going to be softer, still, over time, measurable metrics of success that, your team is really now becoming a team as opposed to you're sort of operating up here and they're operating over there. And hopefully at the end of the day, we get enough done that we meet the, stockholders' objectives for the year.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think certainly you're right. Probably most companies are having that culture where people are sort of understand they're giving their labor to create somebody else's vision. But I think there is this awareness that's sort of coming that companies really are like, well, how can I, somebody who spends 20, 30 years in a career, how does the work make that meaningful? And what does it look like to sort of, spread that business plan into, like you said, holistic plan, right? So how does that benefit their life? Where do they see the quality of life increasing for the stakeholders in the employee sector, And so I think these ideas are ultimately, there's another gentleman I had on here who gave me a great nugget of wisdom. He said, everybody's talking about workplace culture right now. And he goes, you don't fix workplace culture by focusing on the culture. You fix it by focusing on the meaning of the work. You have to keep talking about the ideal. You never reach the ideal. It's just, this is the ideal that we're upholding with our work here. And I think there's something related to what you're talking about here too. You're just sort of individuals and companies the tools to be able to build that.
Yeah, and actually that's one of the workshops that we have is create a chief culture officer, but not to do the bad way of messing that idea up, but to do it the right way that you just described, which is, digging into what is that really going to mean and how do we really move culture in the right direction so that everybody is benefiting and therefore everybody's going to jump on the bandwagon as opposed to sounds great in the boardroom, but by the time you get down to the floor level, they're like another dumb idea from the 10th floor and it dies a premature death.
I think that's what seems to me meaningful about this work, because I think, when I think back to my corporate career, there was a lot of that. We had some really great ideas that sort of would not be implemented fully, or, they didn't land. We didn't have buy-in. And sort of, it seems to me that when you're talking about the holistic nature of this, you're offering the 10th floor, like the scaffolding to be able to build this company on. And I think that's really, really important.
Yeah. We tend to think that that concept is one of the new things that there isn't any of those books on the shelf that you talked about earlier about leadership or management or making a better company or whatever. There really is talking in the kinds of things that we've talked about in a number of cases today.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about the Comfort, Peace, and Freedom Foundation, which is another one of Ken has started this foundation, right? And
that's correct. Ken Rusk is the founder of it. Ken's an interesting guy, self-made man. In high school, his part-time job was working for a dry-proofing company in the area. As he was getting ready to go to college, which was his plan, the guy that owned that dry-proofing company said, I'm going to start franchising these around the country. I need somebody to be my point person on the ground. Would you be willing to do that? And he said, sure. And so he gave up going to college, and for the next several years, he's, living all over the place out of a suitcase, creating the next franchise. And when he got tired of living out of a suitcase, he took one of the franchises in the greater Toledo area, and then he's built that into Rusk Industries, which is beyond just the dry proofing stuff. He's got other construction related, for the most part, enterprises going. And he has always been somebody that is incredibly grateful for what he's been given. I mean, he's got all the toys. He's got, more money and success than 99% of people are going to ever have. And he really does want to give back. And one of the ways is through this foundation that he created to provide this life planning potential for those that have had the worst day that almost anybody can have in their life. So
Yeah. Yeah.
kudos to him. And I'm incredibly blessed to have found him. I don't think that was pure accident. I think that was somewhat divine intervention. And because it's a great capstone for what I've been doing, where it blends my consulting with my military stuff as I try and get out to help communities like our veterans and active duty military.
Yeah. So it just, in your mind, it's funny because it's Comfort, Peace, and Freedom Foundation. Is there, I don't know, what to you, Dave, what order do those come in? Are they sort of set up in order, or is there?
That's a great question. I've never really had the insight to ask, and I now need to ask that of Ken the next time I talk to him. Is exactly, I think in the book he may touch on that a bit.
Yeah.
Where because in a way, to give a little teaser, his book is Blue Collar Cash, which the title is horrible for what we're talking about today. But half the book is literally not about the virtues and how going into the blue collar arena these days is a very financially smart thing to do, unless you have a great vision for what you're going to do if you go to college. If you want to be an accountant or a doctor, okay, well then college is a great thing. But if you really don't know what you're going to do, spending 4 or 5 years and a couple $100,000 and then being in debt, having no job, and working at the local, coffee shop as a barista that you could have gotten as a job coming out of high school. Not a really great thing. But the other half of the book is literally step by step the things we've been talking about today. And you read the book is one way that you can create your own plans. But his foundation was a way to do this. But the book actually got created, the planning part of it, as a result of his daughter at a very young age being diagnosed with melanoma of the eye, something I'd never heard of. And eventually it cost her eye, but at the time there was a significant period of time where her life was not 100% guaranteed. But fast forward, she's a mother of a brand new baby. Life's great, living the dream, and it's all good. But that was sort of a catalyst that got Ken committing to paper these ideas that eventually became the guts of the book, because he really wanted to be able to share with her in the event that she was able to persevere through this, so that she didn't get stuck because of the adversity that she had suffered as a young child. So, it's all just something that really makes this such an easy thing to be passionate about from my perspective.
Absolutely. And you're right. The blue collar cash it doesn't suggest that it would come from a place like that, right? But I mean, the more that I looked into it, it was about building a secure, happy life through blue collar work without a college degree, which is, it's almost a controversial thing to say these days.
But unfortunately, it's becoming more, there is greater interest in the trades and so on. And I think it's simply because the math is becoming so powerful, and I'm living this right now. By the time I get both my children through college, and thank God they're getting out in 4 years, not taking an extra year or two, victory lap. It's still going to probably be, 400,000, and they're going to state schools. They're not, you go to Harvard, you can add, doubling of that figure. And if you're not coming out and trying to get a job, that if you had that as college debt, it's going to take you forever to pay that off. Whereas if you go into the trades right out of high school, there's no debt, and you're making, high, 5 figures, and very quickly, probably you're cracking into 6 figures. You do the math on that. You avoid $200,000 to $400,000 of college cost, and you're generating upwards of $100,000 a year. You're looking at almost $1 million delta, at least $500,000, in what your net worth is at the end of that 4-year period of time. So, and thank God, because we obviously need tradespeople, because they're retiring a lot faster than even opening up of the spigot to put new people into the trades is allowing for. And AI is not going to, do drywalling. He's not going to be your plumber. Maybe, 200 years from now, those things will be handled by machines. But people are definitely going to be needed to do those things.
Yeah.
And it is a great way of making a great living.
I think I just read something somewhere the other day. I know that's very concrete and descriptive, but that HVAC techs and specialists is like one of the most sought after. Like there's a shortage, but they can't staff these places. There's such a need for it, and I thought that was interesting. And I was sort of blown away at the money that you can make doing that. It's easily 6 figures. So
eventually the supply and demand curves, they actually do work if you don't put a ton of regulation and other outside governors on that engine. I mean, it will eventually balance things out. And we're beginning to get to that tipping point where what you're getting out of that college experience, I mean, literally one semester of my kids is pretty much what it cost me to get through 4 years of college.
Yeah.
I don't think
wild.
Even the college people would say that it's that much better now than it was back when I was going through.
Yeah. So the last thing I had a note on here is you had mentioned in some of our correspondence about a new book, Rainmakers and Rock Stars, and I couldn't find a whole lot of information in my research on this. What is this project all about?
Ken and his co-author, John Skomsky, who is a financial planner, by the way, but he has other life experiences, and that's why he's co-authoring this book with Ken. But basically, they just turned in their homework for the first set of galley sheets. So we're looking at a publication of ideally in time for the holidays to be on shelves for purchase at that time of the year. Otherwise, it could very well run into early next year for the book to come out. But basically, and that title may or may not survive first contact with the publisher. That's the working title right now.
Of course.
But the concept behind the book is really, it's a series of chapters that are sort of standalone. And they talk about things, some of which we talked about today, the whole idea of integrating employees' plans with corporate planning, stock, or some other kind of way of making a visible commitment financially to get better buy-in from your team. Things like that. So each chapter is sort of a standalone lesson learned in Ken's life. He is, as part of his way of giving back, is sharing those experiences. A lot of the chapters came out of the various workshops that are available for companies to sign up for. So hopefully it'll be on bookstores' shelves before the end of the year.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing that inside info for us here.
That's it. Yeah, it's inside publishing right now. Is that there's it's not a sequel. It's a totally different theme for the book. And really, it lays down much better for the business community and people who want to, thrive in the business community. Although a lot of the ideas can work for other industries too, even government and so on. You could definitely walk away with a number of things that like, that's a good idea. I hadn't thought of that, and it'll make your life better.
Well, Dave, I want to be mindful of your time. And so there's all kinds of things that we could have gone into. I wonder, and I just want to leave you with the last word.
Yeah. Clearly this has been such a great conversation. Your background lends well to what I've been doing. So it makes it very easy to talk back and forth rather than it becomes very lecture-like, which is horribly boring and no fun for anybody.
Yeah, sure.
I would just leave it as a call to action to people that are listening, is to take seriously the fact that if you're failing to plan, you're planning to fail. And it doesn't take a lot of time to do this, whether you use Ken's program or other programs to actually come up with goals and goal achievement. There's lots of ways you can come up with something independently, but please, people should take that very, very seriously. It does pay that kind of, whether yours is going to be ninefold return on that investment or something different. Intellectually, that it's not going to be no better or worse than if you invest into it. So I definitely ask people to seriously look at adding this as part of their, like brushing your teeth. It's just part of your life process, and it will serve you all the way through. I mean, in some ways, even if you're in your 20s, you're starting to create your bucket list so that when you get to be my age and you're starting to make sure you are getting those things checked off, you're ready to do that because all the other parts of your journey have fallen in line so that you have the luxury of enjoying your golden years rather than far too many people, once they retire, it's the worst period of their life. And it's so sad. And it's oftentimes not even just a lack of money. It's that they just lose their purpose and so on. And that's why, while everybody should have a life plan and there's no good time or whatever, there are times where you really should be doing a serious update of your plan. Coming out of college or school, if you have a job change, family, you go from being single to starting a family. Are you getting ready for retirement? If you do, unfortunately, have health issues, there's some times in your life where this isn't really nice to have or an optional
Yeah.
kind of thing where I can take it or leave it. You really are doing yourself a serious disservice and may very well hinder your future journey if you don't take this very seriously. So I
Yeah.
definitely encourage people to do that. And corporations, we've talked about that extensively today, will see the return on that investment. I almost can
Yeah.
guarantee that, more IT equipment, more this, more that, all that would be good to the bottom line. I don't think you're going to find something that's going to give you probably a better return on your investment than this, because it's really not very expensive in money, certainly, and certainly not even in time.
Yeah. Well, where can people connect with you online, or if they wanted to learn more about your work, Dave, or
Well, I'm
Ken's
sure
work?
it'll be in the notes, but I
Sure.
have my commercial message right here.
All right. All right. Veteransuccess.org, kenrusk.com.
So
It certainly will be in the show notes.
the Veteran Success is the Comfort, Peace, and Freedom website, and then the kenrusk.com is where you can actually find the online version of the program. You can find Ken's book there. I think he's got clicks for virtually every book publisher, Amazon on down.
Yeah.
And then if somebody wants to contact me personally, then here is my contact information.
Howe at kenrusk.com. Also be in the show notes.
And the last part of the commercial message is,
there it is.
This is the book, Ken Rusk, Blue Collar Cash. And despite being somewhat mistitled for our topic today, trust me, it actually is about 50% of the book. And even the stuff that deals with blue collar, if you're not interested or you're well past making that kind of decision, you will find it somewhat interesting. And for businesses that are competing with blue collar or are in those trade related kinds of enterprises, you may very well pick up some tips that would be helpful as you're trying to compete for labor in a tightening labor market. So there actually could be something that's helpful for people in that space.
Well, Dave, thank you. I find myself inspired by your life of service and the work that you're doing now. So thank you for sharing some of that wisdom with us today.
Well, Ryan, this has been a great conversation. Hope you got as much and enjoyed it as much as I did today. And I wish you the very, very best as you're doing in similar ways, the same kind of coaching, mentoring, helping people just get to a better place in their corporate life or as an individual. So
absolutely.
Continued success.
Well, thank you, sir. Appreciate your time.
Take care. Have a good one.
What I keep coming back to from this conversation is this. Most people are not failing because they lack ability. They're struggling because they're moving forward without enough intention. Dave Howe brought a powerful reminder to this conversation. If you don't take time to shape your life, life will shape it for you. And often not in the way you would have chosen. This episode was really about more than goals. It's about stepping back long enough to ask better questions. What matters most? What kind of life am I actually building? What would I regret not giving myself the chance to live? That kind of reflection can really change everything. This conversation resonated with you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the show here or at youtube.com/at the Personal Success Podcast. And take a few quiet minutes today to ask yourself one honest question. Am I living by default or by design? Till next time, keep defining success on your own terms.